Imagine waking up one morning and realizing that the very thing you've spent your entire life running from, the ache in your chest, the shadow behind your thoughts, the quiet loneliness that stares back at you from the mirror, has stopped chasing you. Not because it disappeared, but because it simply sat down and waited. It did not need to pursue you anymore. It knew one day you would turn around, exhausted, and see it sitting there, calm and immovable, as though it had been patiently expecting your return. What happens in that moment? Do you recoil in fear, having built your existence on avoiding that very confrontation? Or do you lean in, trembling but curious, to finally meet the face of the pain you never dared to name? Here's the paradox. The more you run from your pain, the more it governs you. You flee from despair, and it shapes the direction of your life. You flee from loneliness, and it determines the relationships you cling to. You flee from fear, and it scripts the choices that masquerade as freedom. Running feels like self-preservation, but in truth, it is surrender. Because what could be less free than letting the very thing you refuse to face dictate every road you take? It is a strange tyranny. You can spend years, decades even, constructing a life of distractions, achievements, schedules, responsibilities, all in the name of moving forward. Yet beneath that forward momentum lies a hidden gravity, an unspoken avoidance, an orbit fixed around one unsolved constellation of pain. Has it ever struck you as unsettling that the memories you repress are, in fact, the architects of the present? That the trauma you refuse to see does not disappear when ignored, but quietly operates your strings from behind the curtain? What if the greatest illusion of control isn't in what we choose, but in what we cannot bear to choose because pain already vetoed the options? Think about this. Imagine two people standing at a crossroads. Both believe themselves to be choosing freely. One avoids intimacy because they were abandoned long ago. The other avoids stillness because silence reeks of unbearable emptiness. Neither would say aloud, "I am controlled by what I won't face." And yet, their choices have already been chosen for them, not by conscious desire, but by a silent strategy of escape. So what does it mean to stop running? What does it mean to turn directly toward the thing that terrifies you most? The memory, the fear, the wound, the hollowness. Is it courage or madness to deliberately enter the storm you've spent a lifetime avoiding? Could pain itself hold something other than destruction, perhaps even liberation? There is a dangerous thought here. What if pain is not the enemy you imagine it to be? What if the very act of avoiding it is the knife that deepens it? We are a species obsessed with alleviating discomfort, through medicine, through entertainment, through endless scrolling. Numbness has become our silent religion, worshipped in every glowing screen and quick fix. But here's the terrifying suspicion. In anesthetizing ourselves, we may also be killing the very part of us that grows through suffering, the part that alchemizes agony into wisdom. What is pain, really? Is it merely a signal to retreat, an evolutionary alarm meant to keep us alive? Or could it be more, something metaphysical, a messenger carrying truths too raw to be pleasant, but too important to be ignored? Perhaps pain is not there to stop us from living, but to force us into living more deeply than comfort ever could. Every religion, every philosophy worth its salt, has stumbled on this same jagged rock. Life is suffering. Yet, we spend our days pretending otherwise, building elaborate sanctuaries of distraction to avoid the unavoidable. The question is no longer whether you can outrun pain. You can't. The question becomes, what happens the day you stop trying? The mind flinches at this idea. What would it mean to sit with the ache that gnaws at your solitude? To stop medicating the grief and instead let it wash over you, perhaps to the point of breaking? Would you emerge shattered beyond repair, or reborn with eyes that finally see? Imagine, just for a moment, that the very thing you dread most isn't a poison, but a doorway. Imagine pain as a gatekeeper, fierce but not malevolent, whose task is to ensure only those willing to bear its weight may enter the deeper chambers of existence. If that were true, then every time you run from pain, you're not escaping a monster. You're refusing an initiation. And here lies the great question, the one that ripples across your skin as both horror and invitation. What if the path to freedom runs directly through the heart of agony? What if the wound you fear to touch is, in truth, the place where your soul is asking to awaken? Pause here. Feel it, not with words, but in the pit of your stomach. The choices you've made, the lives you've lived, the moments you've avoided. How many of them were simply echoes of the running? And how different would your life look if you dared to stop? We stand here, at the threshold, where every instinct screams, flee. Yet somewhere deeper, quieter, another voice whispers, turn around. And so, we begin. The hidden problem and its psychological, philosophical roots. To understand why running from pain has become the default setting of our existence, we must look beyond the surface, beyond the instinct to recoil from suffering, and examine the philosophical and psychological scaffolding propping this reflex up. For most of human history, thinkers have wrestled with suffering not as a glitch in the system, but as the very texture of existence. And yet, in our modern age, we treat it as an intruder, an anomaly, something that has no rightful place in a life well lived. Where did this shift come from? Consider the words of Friedrich Nietzsche, who declared, "To live is to suffer, to survive is to find some meaning in the suffering." Nietzsche was pointing to a profound recognition that suffering is not simply unavoidable but foundational. Without it, there is no growth, no transformation, no authentic identity. Pain dissolves illusions. It burns away trivialities and forces us to confront the rawness of life. Yet in our cultural obsession with comfort and progress, we've been subtly taught to despise pain as nothing but a malfunction. Carl Jung, another thinker who understood the subterranean depths of the psyche, argued that neurosis is always a substitute for legitimate suffering. In other words, the more you dodge pain, the more it mutates, reappearing as anxiety, compulsions, emptiness, and addictions. What was once a thorn becomes, through avoidance, a forest of shadows in the unconscious. The very attempt to escape pain entangles us deeper in it. Our ailments, our repeating cycles, are whispers of the suffering we refuse to face directly. But why this avoidance? Why has humanity developed the reflex to turn away? In part, the answer lurks within evolutionary wiring. Pain presented itself as a signal for survival. Fire burns, predators bite, and starvation weakens. Moving away from pain often meant prolonging life. But somewhere along the line, this instinct, so adaptive in the physical world, was misapplied to the psychological and existential dimensions. The mind started treating grief, shame, fear, and despair as though they were saber-toothed tigers, threats to annihilation best escaped rather than engaged. Fast forward to modern society, and this aversion has been amplified, industrialized, and commodified. Pleasure, distraction, and numbness are no longer just accessible. They are marketed as necessities. Fast entertainment, pharmaceuticals, life hacks, retail therapy, positive vibes only. Every tool at our disposal whispers the same message. If it hurts, escape it. Entire economies thrive on selling escapes from discomfort. Aldous Huxley once warned that human beings might willingly trade their freedom for pleasure, and our current condition seems to prove his prophecy. We wear golden chains, handcuffed by our fear of pain. And yet, beneath this shiny surface of endless distraction, another truth lurks. The truth Viktor Frankl uncovered in the crucible of human suffering during his time in concentration camps. He observed that suffering inescapably belongs to life, like fate and death. But once we find meaning in it, suffering ceases to be suffering. It transforms. Instead of being a wall we must avoid, it becomes a doorway we can walk through. The tragedy of our avoidance is not only that we remain controlled by what we fear, but that we miss the alchemy pain offers. The raw potential for depth, compassion, self-knowledge, and purpose. Here is the hidden problem revealed. Pain, left unacknowledged, becomes unconscious pain. Unconscious pain dictates our behaviors without us ever noticing. We tell ourselves we choose certain relationships, careers, or ways of living, while in truth, we are merely negotiating with our unhealed wounds. The child abandoned becomes the adult who hides behind endless work to avoid intimacy. The shamed teenager becomes the performer who needs constant validation. The grief-stricken young adult becomes the partner who clings desperately, terrified to be left again. Each persona is not so much chosen as it is inherited, fragments sculpted by unfinished suffering. Nietzsche's proclamation to say yes to life, even in its strangest and harshest problems, reminds us that only by integrating the difficult do we live authentically. Yet instead, modern culture erases the rites of passage once meant to honor pain. Where ancient tribes initiated members through ordeal, symbolic death, or physical trial, our society coerces us into burying suffering under achievement milestones and digital distractions. The unconscious hunger for initiation spills out sideways. We chase danger, fall into addiction, self-sabotage, or seek chaos, not as accidents, but as unconscious attempts at confrontation. Pain finds its way back to us one way or another. So, the roots of this hidden problem stretch wide. Biological instinct, cultural conditioning, philosophical denial, and personal fear. When these threads weave together, they leave humanity trapped in a grand paradox. We avoid pain hoping for peace, yet that very avoidance becomes the source of our unrest. The strange irony, it takes more energy to avoid pain than to face it. A person may spend decades guarding against sorrow, suppressing memories, or performing a version of themselves polished and sanitized for the world, while inside, the unattended wound festers. To face pain requires courage, yes, but to avoid pain requires constant vigilance, constant consumption, constant running without rest. What we call normal life is often the long shadow of avoidance masquerading as ambition, productivity, or self-preservation. Jean-Paul Sartre, under his existential microscope, might diagnose avoidance as bad faith, the refusal to face the raw truth of our condition and instead live behind excuses and illusions. Bad faith is not simply lying to others, but to oneself, pretending you are free while living as though chained by forces you dare not confront. The greatest chain of all is fear of suffering. And here is the philosophical twist. Perhaps pain does not imprison us. Perhaps it is the refusal to engage with pain that creates the prison. The bars are not made of agony itself, but of denial. Misunderstood, pain is endured meaninglessly, a torment unredeemed. Engaged honestly, it becomes a forge, a shaper of strength. Our greatest thinkers, Schopenhauer with his bleak recognition of life's intrinsic suffering, Frankl with his insistence on meaning, Jung with his call to integration, Nietzsche with his cry for affirmation, all, in their varied ways, circle this same core reality. Suffering is not an aberration, but the crucible of existence. To reject it is to reject life itself. And so the question shifts. It is no longer, how can I avoid pain? That is both impossible and illusory. The true question is, what happens if I stop fleeing long enough to listen to what my suffering is trying to teach me? Thus emerges a haunting recognition. What we've mistaken as the enemy may have always been our teacher. The problem has been revealed. But if we refuse to look it in the eye, if we smother it beneath comfort and denial, what then? What happens when the unacknowledged builds, generation after generation, until it becomes not just a private wound, but a societal one? The answer lies in the unseen consequences, the silent architecture of lives shaped by suffering we dare not face. The unseen consequences. When you run from pain, you may think you escape it, but pain is not like an intruder who leaves when ignored. It is more like an unpaid debt accumulating silent interest. Its influence may not be visible in the immediate moment, but over the years, it seeps into the contours of your life, shaping who you are, what you love, and how you relate to others. Imagine a person who cannot bear the silence of loneliness. On the surface, Their life may appear full, crowds of friends, a glowing social media presence, an endless list of plans. But underneath, their every action is dictated by the fear of quiet. They are not spending time with people out of love, but out of flight from the unbearable void. If asked whether they are free, they might loudly say yes. But freedom evaporates the moment you realize that every choice is chained to the avoidance of pain. That is the first consequence, the illusion of free will. You think you choose your life, but really, your wounds hold the pen. Your decisions become elaborate detours designed to never scrape against the scar tissue of your soul. A person hurt in love seeks shallow connections, swearing they value independence. Another, burned by failure, designs their existence around safety and mediocrity, dressing it up as realism. The self is not free, it's cleverly disguised avoidance. The second consequence is inherited suffering. Pain denied in one generation bleeds into the next. The father who never confronted his shame raises a child who unconsciously inherits that same silent weight. The mother who runs endlessly from her grief teaches her children that tears are forbidden, that vulnerability is weakness. Jung called this the unlived life of the parent, a shadow passed down through the family line. A society built on repression inevitably raises generations who confuse numbing with living. And here comes the most dangerous twist. Unacknowledged pain does not simply stay inside. It seeks expression. When expressed openly, it can heal. When repressed, it mutates. It surfaces in strange, corrosive ways: bitter resentment, passive-aggressive hostility, addictions, obsessions, self-sabotage, prejudices. Pain, when buried, does not die. It grows roots in the dark and cracks the foundations of our lives when we least expect it. Think about the neurological side for a moment. The human brain is wired with mechanisms like the amygdala, constantly scanning for threats, and the prefrontal cortex, trying to regulate those instinctive fears. When pain is repressed, the brain continues to mark it as unresolved danger. This creates a chronic state of vigilance, anxiety, restlessness, intrusive thoughts. The body, too, keeps the score. Suppressed emotion can manifest as tight muscles, chronic fatigue, digestive issues, even weakened immunity. Running from pain not only distorts identity, it silently burns the body from within. And still, the mind insists, "I am fine," because one of the cruelest consequences of repression is blindness. You cannot heal what you won't admit exists. Pain becomes the ghost in the machinery, the unseen hand at the wheel. How many times have people woken up and wondered, why do I keep repeating these patterns? Why do I choose the same broken relationships, the same draining jobs, the same habits that leave me empty? It is not fate. It is the wound steering the ship, disguised as coincidence. This blindness scales beyond the personal into the societal. Look around. The frantic consumerism, the endless dopamine loops of social media, the obsession with productivity. Are these not symptoms of a culture frantically avoiding the silence where pain might whisper its truths? We anesthetize entire populations with endless entertainment, pharmaceuticals, and distractions because the collective can no longer sit face to face with discomfort. Wars are fought not only for resources or power, but often for unacknowledged fears. Fear of decline, fear of humiliation, fear of insignificance. Xenophobia is not simply hatred of the other, but fear projected outward. Fear of one's own weakness disguised as hostility to a foreign face. Entire systems of oppression can be understood as the externalization of collective wounds. The unseen consequence of personal avoidance becomes global distortion. And here is where the urgency spikes. Because avoidance, once crystallized, doesn't just cost you your freedom, it costs you your life. Think of the man who spends 40 years fleeing the shame of failure, never daring to attempt what might break him open. At the end of his life, he wonders if he ever lived at all. Think of the woman who numbs her grief with busyness until her body breaks beneath the strain. Think of the countless individuals who trade authenticity for survival and die never knowing themselves. All of it, the addictions, the compulsions, the restless consumerism, the wars, the depressed immune systems, the endless cycles of repeated mistakes, traces back to the same root. We refuse to stop running. But pause here. Ask yourself, if pain affects you this deeply when ignored, what might happen if you turn toward it? If the body collapses under the weight of repression, what might it do with the energy released by acceptance? If the psyche becomes enslaved by avoidance, what kind of liberation might be possible through confrontation? Here lies the third great consequence, the missed potential of healing. Buried within every wound is not only anguish, but also the seed of transformation. Suffering endured consciously has the power to awaken compassion, to deepen meaning, to sharpen authenticity. But to run endlessly is to bury that seed beneath the soil, never allowing it to crack open into growth. Humanity loses as much as it suffers when avoidance prevails. There is something profoundly tragic about this truth. The thing we fear most may be the thing most capable of saving us. Pain, allowed to speak, may guide us toward meaning. Pain, embraced, may teach us endurance, compassion, even love in its rawest form. But silenced, it festers, and the consequences multiply like unchecked fire. So here we stand, at the recognition of the hidden cost. Avoidance guarantees not the absence of pain, but its amplification, subtle at first, then overwhelming. You are confronted with a question. Which price is greater, the brief agony of facing your suffering, or the lifelong tax of running from it? The paradox tightens like a noose. The thing you resist is the thing that enslaves you. The thing you enter is the thing that frees you. And so, the stage is set for rebellion. If we are trapped, not by pain itself, but by our flight from it, then the only path left is the most counterintuitive one. To stop running, to turn toward the wound, and to reclaim what was lost in the shadows. The rebellion will not be polite. It will not be painless, but it will be the beginning of freedom. The rebellion, how to break free. Up to this point, we've traced the hidden architecture of avoidance. The pain we flee from becomes the author of our choices, the unseen hand steering our destiny. We've exposed its psychological roots and its devastating consequences. And now comes the most pivotal, frightening, and liberating juncture: rebellion. But rebellion in this case is not the kind you might imagine. There are no barricades, no shouting in the streets, no tearing down of governments. The rebellion here is more dangerous because it asks for something far more radical than fighting the outside world. It asks you to stop fighting inside. Yes, you read that correctly. The rebellion is not to defeat the pain, but to face it, to stop, to sit, to listen, to invite the very thing you have feared into your presence and refuse to flinch. It is counterintuitive, almost insane by cultural standards. After all, nearly everything you've been taught says pain is the enemy. But perhaps true rebellion is daring to live opposite to the script society fed you. Think of it as an uprising against the numbness that has ruled over you, a mutiny against the tyranny of avoidance. The first step of rebellion is recognition, to pause long enough to name what you've long avoided. Something in me hurts, and I have been running. This seems trivial, but it is revolutionary, because most humans spend their entire lives weaving excuses around their avoidance. I'm too busy. I'm just not that type of person. I don't need to think about the past. But rebellion begins with stripping away these masks and calling the pain by its true name. The second step is descent into the wound, rather than elevation above it. This is where Nietzsche's call to amor fati becomes your rallying cry. Love your fate, say yes to life, not only the sunsets and embraces, but also the failures, betrayals, and losses. The rebel is the one who walks into pain not with clenched teeth, but with open arms, whispering, "Teach me." This is not a submission. It is courage in its purest essence. It is choosing to confront the storm rather than endlessly circling around its edges. Take Viktor Frankl, who survived Auschwitz by clinging not to escape, but to meaning. He discovered that even the deepest agony could be illuminated by purpose. that a man who sees meaning in suffering ceases to be utterly broken by it. His rebellion was not to flee the camps, an impossibility, but to find within them a radical new way of being, to define his suffering instead of letting it define him. Frankl's insight shows us that rebellion is not about refusing pain, but about transforming our relationship to it. Step 3 of rebellion: integration. Carl Jung's shadow work remains one of the clearest blueprints for this stage. To break free requires confronting not just what hurts, but what you've repressed. The anger too frightening to express, the grief too heavy to name, the desires you were taught to shame, the fears you cowardly buried. Integration is not annihilation. It is recognition that every rejected fragment of yourself carries not only threat, but power. To integrate is to reclaim your wholeness. Imagine standing face to face with the monster in the dream and realizing it is carrying a key. That is integration. Realizing that the thing you fled is also the thing you need. Anger, when faced and understood, can birth boundaries and justice. Grief, when given space, deepens the capacity for love. Fear, embraced, sharpens awareness. The rebellion is not a war against pain, but a transmutation of it. Pain becomes the raw material, and consciousness becomes alchemy. Here, clarity arises. Running was easy but enslaving. Rebellion is hard but freeing. But what does rebellion look like in practice, beyond the realm of philosophy? It looks like silence. Choosing to sit in stillness for 10 minutes, without music, without phone, without escape, letting what surfaces, all the restlessness, all the ache, simply be. It looks like dialogue, writing to your pain as though it were a person, asking it what it wants, what it has been trying to protect you from, listening, even if you don't like the answer. It looks like courage in relationships, choosing not to run from intimacy, even when it triggers the fragile scars of your past, letting yourself be seen in your imperfection and risking rejection anyway. It looks like saying no, refusing the sugar rush of distractions that numb but never nourish, choosing discomfort now for the sake of depth later. Above all, rebellion looks like awareness in action, the refusal to let avoidance dictate your path. And yet, rebellion is not glamorous. Do not romanticize it. It is messy. It is terrifying. It feels like walking into fire barefoot. Breaking patterns feels like death because, in a sense, it is the death of your old identity. Sartre's existentialism captures this rupture. To be free is to accept the terrifying responsibility of creating yourself anew every day. Freedom is not comfort. Freedom is standing naked before life's absurdity and choosing anyway. But here's the paradox. In risking this descent, you discover a truth more liberating than any distraction could provide. Slowly, you realize pain does not annihilate you. It unmasks you. It peels away the false identities built from avoidance and reveals the raw, unpolished self beneath. And in that rawness, there is authenticity so sharp it almost glows. No amount of numbing could ever provide such electricity. History is full of rebels who embodied this insight, not against regimes, but against despair itself. Think of Nelson Mandela, enduring 27 years in prison, who could have collapsed into bitterness, but instead emerged with a vision so wide it healed a fractured nation. His rebellion was not against the walls surrounding him, but against the hatred and despair trying to colonize his heart. Think of the mystics of every tradition who entered solitude and darkness, not to escape the world, but to confront the silence where every hidden wound speaks. In their refusal to flee, they discovered what most of us miss. That pain is not finality, but pathway. So here is the challenge to you. Will you rebel? Not with fists clenched against the world, but with arms open toward your own suffering. Not by screaming at the shadows, but by sitting beside them. Not by numbing, but by feeling. Fully, ruthlessly, relentlessly. The rebellion is not glamorous, but it is holy. It is the only rebellion that matters, because in facing pain, you reclaim your life from the claws of avoidance. Every act of rebellion, each time you sit still, Each time you breathe through grief, each time you love vulnerably despite the wound, writes a new script. No longer the script of fear, but the script of freedom. And so, we find ourselves on the brink of the ultimate revelation. If pain has been enemy, teacher, and doorway all along, then what, finally, lies on the other side of fully embracing it? To answer that, we must step beyond rebellion, into the final layer, the ultimate truth hidden within the heart of suffering. The ultimate truth, the final, most powerful realization. Imagine stepping through the threshold. You've walked into the fire, shaken, trembling, convinced you might collapse. And on the other side, you're still standing. Something about that shocks you. You expected devastation, a breaking so brutal it would leave only shards. But instead, you are not shattered. You are lighter. Here lies the first shocking truth, almost an unspoken cosmic joke. Pain was never here to destroy you. It was here to strip you, to peel away the masks, the false certainties, the identities duct taped together from fear. The thing you dreaded most was, in truth, the surgeon, and you were the patient who refused anesthesia because the operation was too frightening to imagine. But now, cut open, you see it clearly. What was removed was not your essence, but your cages. And suddenly this unbearable thought arises. What if all along you were not running from pain, but from life in its rawest form? Because pain, unlike pleasure, refuses to let you skim the surface. Pleasure is delicate, quick-footed, like water evaporating in the sun. Pain sinks deep. It presses into your marrow, sears itself into memory, pulls the soul into depth. To run from pain is to run from depth itself. To embrace it is to finally awaken to the full spectrum of your existence. This is the ultimate turn. Pain is not the opposite of joy, but its doorway. You cannot anesthetize grief without also dulling wonder. You cannot exile despair without also banishing awe. To suppress suffering is to smother vitality. By numbing sadness, you unknowingly numb bliss. The poet Khalil Gibran once wrote that your joy is your sorrow unmasked, and the self-same well from which your laughter rises was often filled with your tears. The deeper sorrow carves into your being, the more joy you can contain. That is the anatomy of emotion. It is not compartmentalized but unified. Saying yes to pain is saying yes to the possibility of joy, too immense to endure without trembling. But here comes the harder, almost unbearable truth. Pain not only deepens joy, it creates meaning. Viktor Frankl was right. Suffering ceases to destroy you when you give it meaning. And in that realization lies the greatest secret of all. Pain was never meaningless. It always had a message, a seed, a curve of destiny hidden inside. You may not have chosen the suffering, but you are free to choose what it becomes within you. Let us pause here. Imagine an old tree, gnarled and twisted by decades of storms. Each scar in its bark, each bent limb, tells the story of endurance, adaptation, survival. Strip that tree of its storms, and you strip it also of its majesty. So it is with the human soul. The cracks cause the light to enter. The scars become your authenticity. And authenticity, that unshakable rootedness of being, is worth every tearing. Here is the paradox sharpened to its final edge. Pain, embraced, is not suffering anymore. It becomes a revelation. When you no longer resist it, it transforms from tormentor to guide. Your anguish whispers, "Look deeper." Your grief insists, "You have loved, and that love was real." Your fear insists, "You are alive, and what you cherish matters." Pain is the magnifying glass that reveals the sacredness of all things. The ultimate truth, then, is radical acceptance. Not passive resignation, but holy affirmation. Nietzsche's yes saying, the amor fati, the love of fate. When you no longer recoil from life's brutalities, you find yourself whispering yes, not only to the sunrise, but to the storm, to the night, to the inevitable losses ahead. And this, yes, astonishingly, births freedom. a freedom far deeper than the shallow freedom of avoiding discomfort. Because to say yes to suffering is to say yes to life entirely, without exemptions. It is to drink existence to the bottom of the cup, bitter sips and all, and discover that beneath the bitterness is something sweeter than you ever imagined. Think of this. What if every wound in your life, the heartbreaks, the betrayals, the failures, was not life's cruelty, but life's attempt to break you open? What if your most harrowing pain was the initiation into becoming who you were always meant to be? To reject it is to reject yourself. To embrace it is to finally meet yourself. The consequence of reaching this stage is profound. Fear loses its teeth, not because pain disappears, but because you are no longer enslaved to its avoidance. When loss comes, you will still grieve, but you will not shatter. When fear rattles, you will still tremble, but you will not flee. Instead of living in the shadows of imagined catastrophes, you live present to each moment, knowing even catastrophe carries a secret gift. This revelation is not abstract. You feel it in your body. The tightness loosens. The vigilance lessens. Energy once spent fighting reality is suddenly freed for living. Creativity thrives in the soil of pain metabolized. Love deepens when you allow it to risk loss. Gratitude swells not in ignoring suffering, but in knowing how fragile and precious all beauty is precisely because it ends. Picture yourself standing at the edge of a cliff at dawn. The air is sharp, the light just beginning to spill over the horizon. You've faced the nights of agony, you've fallen, you've burned, you've wept until the body had nothing left. And here you stand, not untouched but transformed. Pain did not erase you, it revealed you. You are scarred, yes, but those scars are maps, proof that you have walked the long road and did not surrender. And in that moment, watching the sun crest, feeling the raw air in your lungs, you realize something astonishing. You no longer wish to run, because there is nothing left to flee. There is only life, all of it, the beauty and the terror, the kiss and the wound. And in embracing both, you finally understand the truth that was waiting at the heart of pain. You were never meant to escape suffering. You were meant to transmute it into meaning. You were meant to let it carve you deeper so you could hold the immensity of joy. You were meant to drink existence whole, its fire and its sweetness, without turning away. And perhaps, standing there at dawn, you even laugh. Not because the pain is gone, but because you see it clearly now. The very thing you thought was your jailer was your liberator in disguise. This is the ultimate freedom. Not a life without pain, but a life where pain is no longer an enemy, but a companion. A life where suffering opens doors, wounds become wisdom, and fragility becomes the birthplace of love. So, the great question with which you began, what happens when you stop running from pain? Finds its answer here. Sex, 0.05, in the silence after the storm. You stop running, and you begin to live, fully, fearlessly, fiercely alive.